delighted to have you all join us for season 3 of the Technology, Risk and Gambling webinar series. I'm Sally Gainsbury. I'm a professor in the School of Psychology at the University of Sydney. I'm director of the Gambling Treatment and Research Clinic at the Brain and Mind Centre. I am delighted to be joined by my co-host. Over to you, Kahlil.
Hi, I'm Kahlil Philander, and I'm much more poorly dressed than Sally is today. So hello and welcome everybody back to the webinar series. I'm an assistant professor at Washington State University. And let me just say how pleased I am to be back with this whole seminar session. We have a great season ahead, and I think we're starting it off with a heck of a show today. So I will throw things back over to Sally to manage the conversation and introduce today's guests.
Thanks, Kahlil. So for those of you who aren't familiar with the origin of this series, the Technology, Risk and Gambling webinar series came out of a conversation that was held very early on during the COVID lockdowns when we were all missing seeing each other at conferences, lamenting on when we would get to see each other in person, and also talking about the lack of opportunities for early career researchers for us to hear the emerging research that hasn't made it into publications yet. So this webinar series was born out of a desire to do that, and we have had a great success, mostly due to the fantastic community support. So a huge thanks to everyone who is joining us live. Please do say hello to each other. You can chat to each other throughout. It's allowed to be cheeky and chat on the side. And we are really happy to be able to bring this community together. So today we are starting off with a bang, and it is not emerging researchers necessarily we're featuring, because you will be very familiar with the names on our panel and the faces on your screen, but we couldn't pass up the opportunity to have live the co-authors of the Pathways model 20 years since it was created. The Pathways model is potentially the most influential conceptual model in the gambling field, created by Professor Blaszczynski and Professor Leonauer, and there's recently been a special issue published in International Gambling Studies by Professor Luke Clark and Assistant Professor Dave Ledgerwood, who are joining us today. So I'm going to briefly give you their bios, although I'm sure everyone is familiar with our guests, and then we'll jump straight into the conversation. As always, chat amongst yourselves online, but if you do have any questions for the panelists, please do pop it into the YouTube comments and we'll try and get to all of those as well. So Professor Leonauer actually has a fantastically interesting background as a clinician and a criminal and civil trials attorney. So such a fascinating perspective to bring to the gambling field. Leah is professor and director of the Centre for Gambling Studies at Rutgers University. She's a member of the board of directors on the National Council of Problem Gambling, and she chairs the research committee, and she did receive the 2019 prestigious research award. Apart from the Pathways model, she has co-authored several majorly influential papers and many papers, including several policy initiatives, which we'll potentially get into how the Pathways model has influenced that. Blaszczynski is Emeritus Professor in the School of Psychology at the University of Sydney. Again, has been involved in many papers and many publications. Obviously, the Pathways model, the Reno model, most of aspects of gambling have been touched on. Luke Clark is Professor in the Department of Psychology and Director of the Centre for Gambling Research at the University of British Columbia. His research focus has, again, changed and influenced many aspects over the field, but at the moment are looking at the psychological features of gambling products, biological and psychological traits related to vulnerability, and the use of behavioural data, which is something we're going to be talking about in later sessions of this series. And lastly, but certainly not least, Associate Professor David Ledgerwood is a clinical psychologist within the Substance Abuse Research Division in the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioural Neuroscience at Wayne State University. His work focuses on the treatment and etiology of substance use and behavioural addictions, and he's done several NIH-funded trials, clinical trials examining behavioural treatments for, amongst other things, smoking cessation amongst individuals living with HIV and parents of teens enrolled in juvenile drug court. So I have to say, if you're new to the gambling field, you have come to the right place, because we're going to unpack the origins of the pathway model and how it has influenced the field. So I'm going to start by asking Emeritus Professor Blaszczynski to briefly provide an overview for anyone who's not on the top of their hand familiar with the pathways model.
Thanks very much, Sally, for that introduction. The pathway models has its origin effectively in my clinical experience since 1977 up to about 1990, where we're doing clinical work with a group of quite severe problem gamblers or pathological gamblers at that particular terminology in those days. And then with the research, and it came to my mind at one particular time in the early 1990s to try to put some sort of conceptual understanding of the different types on the assumption that individuals with a gambling problem weren't a homogeneous group, but rather had different sort of critical pathways into entry into those particular problems. And on a flight between Los Angeles and Sydney, I started to doodle on a napkin in terms of trying to put together the sort of concept that there was an increase in availability and acceptability of gambling, advertising, promotion of it, particularly in the 1980s and then the 1990s with the introduction and spread of electronic gaming machines and casinos. We then looked at the types of disparate results that people had in research, and I tried to make sense of that. So I started to make a doodle with the notion that there were subgroups. And the first one obviously would be the notion that all of these particular gamblers were subject to erroneous cognitions, excitement, and all the conditioning elements that do influence behaviors. But from that point on, I started to distinguish between particular groups based on clinical experience and the notion of some of the research findings. And that is that there's one group of people that have erroneous beliefs regarding the potential that gambling is a form of income. They can win money and they can actually gain substantial financial benefits. They get themselves into problems, and the psychological morbidity is secondary or an outcome of the gambling-related problems that they've experienced. Then we found another group, particularly middle-aged females and some males who experience difficulties in coping with daily stresses. And they found, similar to alcohol and prescription drugs, that these people turn to gambling as a means of emotional escape. And we looked at the background of their family backgrounds, vicarious learning from parents, disruptions to the family, etc., and trauma, part of those as well. And then there was a third group, the impulsive or biologically vulnerable individuals who appeared to be highly impulsive, having some sort of neurological capacity to disregard the consequences of their behavior. And these are the sort of difficult clients to deal with, the ones that you tend to refer on to people that you don't like. They don't turn up for treatment, and then they end up ringing up and making appointments. It's really quite chaotic, but they also experienced other impulsive type behaviors, criminal behaviors, and multiple relationships, etc., which were non-gambling related. And from that, I started to think about the concept of Project Match, which was emerging at that particular stage with the alcohol field. And that is to look at these particular different subgroups and then start to look at the specific treatments that each of those groups required. And they differed quite considerably in the level of intensity and requirements. And I think it's sort of, looking back on it, are probably the sort of foundations for a stepped care approach to dealing with individuals with gambling problems and their families.
From the doodles of an airplane napkin. And for those that don't know, I did my undergraduate and postgraduate studies under the supervision of Professor Blaszczynski, and we might get to that later, that process of coming up with an influential model on an aeroplane. Leah, obviously things have changed in the last 20 years. I would love for you to take us through from those original concepts. And I might say that this paper is the third most cited in the Journal of Addiction. I believe has over 4,000. Is it, Luke? How many citations are we up to now?
2,400.
Yep. So how has the pathways model changed since those original ideas that you and Alex had together?
So I think the main thing was that once we had the theory out there, people started using secondary data analysis with variables that didn't exactly capture the elements that we had proposed in the model to try to see if the model was valid. And some of the studies found it was, some found other subgroups. And so what we wanted to do was look at the pathways model variables specifically and develop a clinical instrument for clinicians to use to help to individualize their treatment. And so we launched the study in Canada, the US, and in Sydney, where we used treatment clinics, and it took a really long time, and we got maybe 1,200 treatment-seeking problem gamblers to complete this very long battery of items. And what we did was we had 62 items that captured the core of the pathways model, and then we had 65 items that captured a range of other risk factors that had been identified in the research literature since the model was published. And then from that, we used EFA and CFA. We did like a classical measurement validation on it. And we came up with the gambling pathways questionnaire. And then this year, we did latent class analysis on the data and came up with a revised model. And some things, for example, ADHD, for example, and comorbid substance use, which we had proposed, did not differentiate among the pathways. They're probably common across the pathways. Same thing with, cognitions and things like that. What did differentiate among the pathways consistently was that the pathway 2s had much higher levels of childhood maltreatment, abuse and witnessing trauma, and more depression and anxiety both before and after gambling became a problem. And they had a coping motivation, more of a stress coping motivation. And then the other important thing is that we had thought that pathway 3 was a subgroup of pathway 2, and that pathway 2 would be the largest group. And what we found was pathway 1 is the largest group, which has, I won't go on to it now, but what we think has really strong policy implications for what's going on now around the world. And pathway 3 was marked by impulsivity, antisocial traits, risk-taking, and a meaning and coping motivation. So there were some differences from the original model.
I would add to that, Leah, that these particular subgroups are not clear-cut, sort of cut at the joint type of groups, that there is obviously, even in the pathway 1, some degree of impulsivity. It depends really on the intensity and the severity of those particular variables that tends to differentiate the groups, rather than being something which is categorically distinct.
Yeah, and when you see how the classes, that's why we use latent class analysis. You can sort of see with the pathway 3s, for example, they were really high in anxiety post-gambling, but not as high as the second subgroup. And there's some overlap with these 3 classes.
And the other, from a clinical perspective, one of the key elements about the pathways model, it helps to identify whether these particular anxiety, depression, substance abuse follows the gambling behaviors and the negative outcomes, or whether it's a precursor and has some etiological contribution to the development of the problem in the first instance. And that, I think, does inform appropriate treatments and interventions.
I might throw over to Professor Clark here, who has been involved in the clinical side of things, to share your perspectives on how has the pathways model, in your opinion and understanding of the field, played a role, and how is it still relevant 20 years later?
Yeah, thanks, Sally. Yeah, it's nice to be here, and looking forward to the third season of this webinar series. I moved into the field of gambling studies just a year or two after the original paper was published. And I've gone back to the Pathways paper many times myself, and I continue to teach the Pathways model in my undergrad course. And I feel that it's clearly still hugely influential, and I think the reason for that is that the paper kind of works at two levels. It has, a very simple take home, but it also has a very kind of rich structure under the hood. So I think the kind of simple message that we need to, move beyond one size fits all explanations in treatment, I think that really resonates with clinicians and counselors, and I've seen that a lot at conferences, and I think that continues to this day. But the other aspect of that is that it succeeds in organizing this huge body of literature, bringing together, as Alex was saying, the environmental factors, the comorbidities, the conditioning theory, the personality, biology, genetics are all in there. And those were very disparate bodies of work at the time. And although the literature there was 20 years old, I feel that it's held up fairly well. I don't think there's any kind of factors or processes that the Pathways model draws on that we would just say today, oh, that was a sort of blind alley. And just putting all of those processes together in how do we kind of sequence these things when we're thinking about the transition from sort of recreational to problematic behavior, I continue to find very useful myself.
Thank you for that. And Dr. Ledgerwood, you have a really great background looking at etiology and also from other addictions and behavioral addictions. Could you talk to how you see the Pathways model and how it compares to what's available in other fields, or is it relevant to other fields of addiction studies?
That's a great question. Thanks, Sally, and everybody for inviting me here today for this. I think it's a really important moment, and especially with the rich history of the Pathways model and sort of where it's come from its roots to Leah and Alex's work in developing the assessment measure and everything else. I think it's been a model that I think initially was sort of slow in terms of getting people's attention, in terms of validating it, but is really like a slow boulder going downhill and picking up steam and picking up more interest over time, in part because it has one great clinical intuitive sort of sense to it, and two, just with every additional study. And I know Leah mentioned that early on the studies focused on secondary data analysis because most of us who are doing work in this area hadn't done from the ground up studies to look at all of the variables in this that are associated with this model. And I came, up around the same time. I think Luke and I are roughly the same age, and we started studying gambling disorder, around 2000 or so. And I was also doing substance use disorder work. And one of the things I really kind of realized at that time, and I often sort of mention to people, is just how far behind the gambling disorder literature was at that time relative to the substance use disorder literature. And in some ways, the gambling disorder literature will never catch up, but it has caught up to a certain extent, in that we have, I think, more of an understanding of some of the processes that go on along with gambling disorder. And I think the Pathways model is a big part of that. I know I did some of those sort of early secondary data analysis studies way back in the day. And one of the studies that for me, always sticks with me as being both methodologically very limited, but also sort of informative, is a study that I did where we basically divided people in a very rough way into high and low depression and anxiety groups, high and low impulsivity groups, in a way that would never get accepted in a publication today, but sort of roughly looking at the various pathways. And among people with gambling disorder who are undergoing cognitive behavior therapy, and this was with Nancy Petrie, and looking at sort of long-term outcomes. And one of the things that we found was that when we looked at people who we categorized roughly as fitting into the emotionally vulnerable group and those who we fit into the emotionally antisocial impulsive group, we found that they actually got better in treatment at the exact same rate as the people we considered to be behaviorally conditioned gamblers. But the difference between the two is that those who are behaviorally conditioned gamblers started off much better off, right? Their symptoms were not as bad. They didn't have quite as many gambling symptoms. Their severity was not quite as bad. But over time, their slopes in terms of improvement in gambling severity was basically identical to the other two groups. And for me, I think that that's the area that we need to sort of move in and sort of match what's been going on in the substance use disorder world, to look at things like what sorts of things predict how well people do in treatment, what people in terms of different subgroups do well in treatment, which people don't necessarily do as well in treatment, and how can we adjust and tailor our treatments to sort of match that and provide better care. I think we concluded that overall, there's a lot of hope for people even who fit into more severe pathways, because they do get better at the same rate as the behaviorally conditioned gamblers, but they probably need somewhat more intensive and longer treatment to get better. So I think we need a better understanding of some of those things going forward. And that's, I think, the next frontier of the pathways model, because we, like I said, we have the model. It makes a lot of scientific and intuitive sense and validated. We have now a valid and very thorough assessment of it. But we haven't really gone to that next frontier, which is understanding how it can influence treatment. I think what Alex was saying about trauma, maltreatment, that sort of thing as a factor related to emotionally vulnerable gambling is huge. And that's a big factor, I think, that will play into that as well.
Thank you so much, David. That you raise a really important point, which is that research has improved in the last 20 years, hopefully. You know, the original studies in gambling, as you say, were well behind the substance use and addiction fields. And we had, you know, relatively small samples of relatively undiverse populations, you know, men who played on slots who were older, like in middle-aged to older men, like that was it. So as our research has become more useful, or students, you know, pretending to play on slots in labs. So as our research has improved, although I think we've got a long way to go, or generations have changed, and the technology, the types of gambling products, how people are playing them have changed. I mean, and again, I'm happy to open up to the panel at this point to say, where are and Dave sort of touched on it, what's the next frontier? Is there something we need to do to look at what's underpinning it? Is the pathways model, you know, what's been done and what are the next steps?
Well, I might as well try and come in and be somewhat controversial. I think that many of the early research was really quite good and set the foundations for a lot of subsequent research, both conceptual and empirical. I think what's happened over time as the field has attracted more and more researchers, there's been a tendency to do a lot of repetition, a lot of recycling of material without really looking at moving forward to the next level. We certainly have different environment and the public health model looking at the sort of proliferation, addiction, and the advertising of gambling and how that's impacting youth, how it's impacting attitudes, and we've got the online gambling and so forth. But my concern about much of the trends in research is the use of these large market research companies. And it becomes really quite easy, cost effective, you can get large numbers, But quite often when you start to look at the findings of them, they're based on statistically significant differences and not clinically relevant differences. And I think from the pathways model that we looked at was effectively, and in fact, all my research has been based on my clinical experience, talking to clients, discussing them, trying to put some sense on their particular different presentations, and trying to encapsulate the notion that when they come to see someone in treatment, they all manifest the same sort of symptomatology. But the important element is to work backwards to try to work out what the critical pathways were to develop that, what variables were important, and then addressing those where relevant. And I think, Dave, taking up your point, the same would be with treatment outcomes. We're looking at the notion of treatments being effective, but then we need to work backwards to see what are the variables that actually lead people to do well, and are they linked up to the pathways model in some way, or do we need to develop a new sort of critical pathway for positive treatment outcomes?
I think that's a great point, Alex. I would sort of chime in as well, just to say that the gambling disorder field has a problem broadly across the board, in that there are very few, probably a handful, maybe a half a dozen studies that look at treatments that are actually designed to address gambling and anything else, right? Like trauma or depression or substance use disorders. And for the most part, there are very few studies that look at how we address co-occurring problems in gambling disorder, despite the fact that co-occurring problems are much more prevalent than having someone with a gambling disorder without a co-occurring problem. So I think that's a great point.
I would add, I think the fact that we found in a few studies that the pathway ones are the largest group versus the twos has real implications for this sort of rapid expansion of sports wagering in North America and elsewhere, and all the rapid expansion of gambling. Because think about, if you can come to the same level of a serious problem just from the ecological factors without any pre-morbid conditions, how many more people are really going to be developing a problem as a result of this? And this really goes to where it's important to sort of learn to tailor these treatments. And I also think the other related piece to this is, Wendy Slutsky's work has really talked about how, genetics plays a strong role, but environment plays an even stronger role. And I think we're in an environment now where youth are being shaped. I mean, in the United States, those ads play all the time, and wagering is now integrated into all sports. I mean, FanDuel was on the pitcher's mound when I was watching the World Series. So young people are being raised to not distinguish between gambling and sports. And I think this is going to play a big role going forward.
No, I tend to agree. I think that there's one of the elements with the environmental factor is that it does encourage people, exposes them to gambling and draws them in. The problem, and this is again from some of the research we've done recently in terms of comparing community and clinical samples, one of the factors that differentiates who comes in for treatment is the level of distress. And my hypothesis is that there is a lot of people out in the community who are experiencing gambling problems to a fairly moderate to severe extent, but they're not experiencing distress. They're able to handle it. It's managed within the family. There may be arguments. There may be a whole range of issues, but it doesn't lead to the stage where there's a level of severity or distress, emotional distress experience that triggers them to seek treatment. That's just simply a hypothesis that some student might like to pursue.
And that raises a good point of, the next generation, and Luke and Dave and Lee, you're seeing students as well. Where is the research going? What are the implications? What are the research topics anyone listening looking for a research topic should be thinking about?
That's a good question. You want to give us away all the secrets? Look, I think it's clearly one of the factors would be in terms of public health. What is the impact of reducing the availability of and advertising of gambling activities and so forth? Changing the environment, what will be that particular impact? Will it simply reduce it to some extent, or will it move people to the underground? And that's one of the sort of core elements. I think one of the issues is money laundering. That's been certainly the topic of conversation within Australia with the Royal Commissions and significant fines for failure to comply with money laundering activities. The Crime Commission identifying a large minority of funding going through illegally, sort of money laundering. The question that came to my mind then is that, well, if a large proportion of money is laundered money, what's the impact there of the prevalence of problem gambling? The per capita expenditure should be adjusted, taking into account the money laundered. If a significant proportion of money is being laundered, and that is now stopped through its regulators, so that has significant implications on government revenue and also available funds for gambling research. So these are some of the questions that are coming up, as I foresee being a challenge to the gambling research field.
Yeah, I was interested in Leah's comment, bringing kind of sports betting into the mix of the Pathway 1 processes. I think is a super interesting point. And in Canada, we're also seeing a rapid expansion of sports betting since the federal bill last year. And when I teach the Pathways model to undergrads, we always spend quite a lot of time on Pathway 1 and how there's this sort of implication in Pathway 1 that is quite scary, that anyone can develop a gambling problem in the absence of any real dispositional vulnerability, and they can basically kind of be in the wrong place at the wrong time. And the kind of main thing that we tend to focus on when we go through that, how would that actually work, is the impact of early big wins, right? That someone can be visiting a casino or betting somehow for the first time. They're maybe there for some other reason. They're there for some social event, but they just put a few dollars in a machine or a few dollars on a sports game, and they hit a big win, and how that can by itself serve as a really powerful conditioning event. So I still feel that that's been an idea that has been kind of anecdotally kicking around in the gambling field for decades, but it's quite central to Pathway 1 and how, the normalization of sports would sort of lay a foundation for that, how, access to gambling apps through a smartphone, wherever you happen to be, that just sort of raises the likelihood of those, first positive encounters. I think we still need to get a much more kind of empirical handle on the formative experience.
Yeah, I think the in-game betting is really significant too. Just looking at the big data that we look at from sports wagering, I mean, a disproportionate amount of the younger bettors are the ones that are doing a much higher amount of the in-game betting, which plays on that impulsivity. And I think that the whole role of sort of peer support and impulsivity and all of that is really fueling a whole lot of this, even if the person's not winning, because when we look at the win-loss percentages on these different types of bets, they're not great. So I think in the sports arena, the early big win may not be as important as it would be in a casino setting. I don't know, but I think it's more that whole camaraderie and the fan experience and that all those subjective factors that you don't have in a casino environment.
I agree. I think that the sort of approach, the cognitive approach to managing the sports bettors versus electronic gaming machines versus table games, poker machines, etc. Poker, Texas Hold'em poker. The cognitions, I think, differ, and again, we can't simply transpose the effectiveness of interventions based on electronic gaming machines through to sports betting because of the nature of the skills, the emotional component, the fans following particular teams. I think that there's a disjoint between the types of treatments being allocated towards electronic gaming machines, casino type games, and sports betting. And I think, from a clinical perspective, I think more attention needs to be directed towards developing effective treatment programs for these difficult to manage because, effectively, some people, not many, but some people do win.
I might just add to that because I think the online aspect of the sports betting and online casinos is so new, and it's something that's really become much more prolific during the pandemic, in particular in a lot of jurisdictions as it's become legalized. And one thing that I've also noticed in going to gambling conferences and that sort of thing is that there's much more of an interest in industry in getting involved with various organizations, people who've traditionally been people in recovery or treatment providers and so forth. And I've had a chance to speak with some of them, and they are developing what they call responsible gambling features to some of their online gaming platforms, especially when it's run by a state or a province. And I know there's some research out there, but I don't think we know very much about how well these things work, right? If there's like a sort of self-exclusion types of things that could be anywhere from a day to indefinite, or other sorts of things, limits on accounts, that sort of thing. These are potentially valuable interventions, but there's something that we really don't understand outside of the industry too much in terms of research. I think more research to look at those things would be great. But the other aspect is, we're developing treatments that are effective for gambling disorder, and yet only about 1 in 10 people with a gambling disorder ever seeks treatment. But if you look at the broader sort of treatment seeking in this group of individuals, maybe 60-70% of them have sought mental health treatment, right? So people go to treatment, but they often don't see the gambling as their problem. They see their mental health issue or addiction, other substance use disorder issue as their problem. So another piece to this is how do we reach out to these folks who already haven't traditionally been going to treatment and try and make treatment more accessible or more appealing to some of these folks. And I think that kind of really fits well with the sports betting and online gambling, because we're going to have to use either mobile health or electronic types of interventions to engage people a little bit more over time.
And that picks up on an audience question from Tom Swanton, who's a PhD candidate at the University of Sydney, asking about how the model's been used in clinical practice. And I would add to that in terms of prevention as well. How is the pathways model being used to inform clinical work and in terms of treatment as well as prevention of gambling problems? Are there any examples of how this has been done internationally, even if it's not in the published literature?
So Italy is the first example I can think of, and they actually published a paper in international gambling studies. They use the GPQ in all of their clinics in Italy, and then they've developed these individualized treatments for each pathway. And they're also doing that in Iowa in the United States, and they've really found that a majority of their clients are pathway 3 gamblers, which typically we would not think would present as much. So, and they said that when they screen them, they know they're not going to stay in treatment as long. So they have a truncated cognitive behavioral treatment for that group.
Yeah, it's interesting. There's been a lot of research done in terms of determining whether the pathways do exist in the empirical evidence for that. But very few tend to look at what they're doing in Italy in terms of comparing the outcomes with pathways and how they're applied in clinical practice. My view is, having trained quite a number of the practitioners in Ontario, the people are using that in their clinical practice, and certainly talking to people in some of the Asian regions, they're applying these interventions. but they're not doing it systematically, and they're not providing research on the outcomes. So that's another good research for a clinical researcher to look at.
And Leah, can you quickly mention, just as a side note, anything about the screening tools? What questionnaires we can use to identify the pathways model?
Well, we use the GPQ, the gambling pathways questionnaire, and that's available online. It's 48 items, and it has score. At some point, we're going to put it on online scoring because the scoring is a little complicated. That's typically what we would suggest using. I mean, the other thing in our study, and this goes to Dave's point, is we found that people, all the gambling screens and activities use the word gambling. We have now removed the word gambling from everything. We've, even our short screens, we say activities, we take the word gambling out, and we found that people are much more likely to endorse when that word is not in there, because gambling is glamorized so much, but being a gambler is still stigmatized. And I think that's one reason why we don't see as many people.
That's really interesting. I'm going to ask one more question, and then I'm going to throw to Luke, because I know he has a question as well. Alex and Leah, how do you respond to any, you've obviously presented this model and discussed this over the last 20 years. What are the common criticisms that come up, and how are these addressed? If any, maybe no one's ever criticized the model.
They've criticized me, but not the model. I've not had any sort of criticism of it. I think I've been actually quite humbled by the way in which people have responded positively to it, both clinicians and researchers. There've been no real criticism. There's been refinements or attempts at refinements of a particular model and the particular subgroups, which was the initial intent conceptually when I developed the pathways model, and with Leah's involvement. It was effectively to set up a conceptual model that others could then test whether it works or not, with the expectation that there would be iterations over the next 25, 30 years. And I've been quite surprised how stable it's been, with sort of minor tweaks here and there. But the tweaks themselves are sort of minutiae rather than sort of conceptual shifts. So I've been quite sort of humbled and unexpected in terms of the impact. It almost never was published because I submitted it to Addictions, and we came back with the standard review comments. And then I thought, it's too difficult to address those particular reviewer comments, and sort of sat there. And then Leah jumped in and took out the whip, and we sort of revised it and submitted it. So I'm glad it did. I'm glad it did.
That sort of leads on quite nicely to the question that I wanted to ask, which is coming from, I suppose, less of a gambling studies perspective and more of just a general academic perspective. And I spend a lot of time with my students at the moment talking about academic writing. So with any paper that gets 2,400 cites, yeah, you did a bunch of things right, but maybe, as you were saying, Alex, at the time you don't know whether you're doing it right or not. So what was the process of writing actually like, more as a kind of author than as a researcher, maybe? Can you share any tips, or how you allocated different parts of the paper between Leah and yourself?
Well, Leah, do you want to comment?
I mean, we kind of always do things in an iterative fashion. So whenever we wrote together for 22 years or whatever, somebody starts with an idea, puts it on paper, and then the next one adds to it. And then we just go back and forth. So Alex had his doodles, and then he wrote, the blocks, and then I refined it, and then it went back. I mean, that's how we've always done our work pretty much, right, Alex?
Yeah. Well, one of the things about the sort of origin of these particular conceptual models is, in my view, having more time to think about things and letting it evolve. The model came to mind in the early 1990s, and I took the doodles, put them into a PowerPoint presentation, and submitted those to the grand rounds within the Prince of Wales Psychiatric Unit. And the grand rounds was sort of a critical place to get feedback regarding conceptual work and clinicians and researchers there. And they pointed out, is a bipolar sort of dimensions, not bipolar disorder, but bipolar dimensions in terms of the concepts. Some people gave some ideas, and then over time, and I think this is the important element, is then to look at clinical experiences and trying to apply what you're thinking to the types of clients you're seeing, and then gradually looking at the research and trying to explain how researchers have different sort of outcomes, and yet they've done really good research. And my view effectively was that there was some research who were dealing primarily at the community level with the pathway 1 type gamblers, and then you've got other people in tertiary university with the pathway 3 people with quite serious difficulties and requiring great interventions, and then another group that were effectively in private practice or with a range of other people. So it sort of worked out, and I think the other important element is to talk to people with divergent views, and rather than being defensive, is to try to work out whether or not you're on the right track, take on board any criticism constructively, and then work out how to address those particular issues. The notion of, as I teach my students, is you have an idea, then you try to undermine it as much as possible. And if you can't undermine it, as I think Sherlock Holmes said, then it must be the truth.
It's interesting how long it took to come to fruition from the ground rounds in the early 90s. So it was a long time in the sort of cogitation process, and I like that idea that a lot of thought went into it.
Most of the what I would regard as the influential papers that I've written tended to have an evolution over time and discussions, quite robust discussions with other individuals. There's been, again, other studies where I picked up on a particular idea, the sensation-seeking one. I thought this was relatively straightforward, see clients, administer the measure, and sort of publish it. Crime and gambling, again, these sort of elements. But I think that the more important ones, I think, take time. And I think one of the important elements, and I think it's a problem or a challenge with many current students, is that there's a flood of information on the internet. People don't have time to sit back and idly think. They're always sort of driven to produce something rather than sort of sitting back and taking a day just to think and cogitate about a particular problem.
And I'm really interested, and Dave and Luke, you both co-edited the special issue of the Pathways model in international gambling studies to look at how this model has been picked up from other fields. Leah is obviously from a different field than Alex, and Leah with her legal background, and Alex with his psychology and psychiatry background. You guys both looked at all the papers they were coming in and looked across the field to see who was working in this. We've just had a question come in which touched on this as well, as how can governments and other stakeholders use this? Thinking, within academia, beyond the initial field of gambling studies or across different stakeholders, how is the Pathways model being used, or how could it be used?
Is that directed to anyone?
I don't know if Luke wanted to go first, or either way.
Well, look,
Dave, you go first.
Yeah, I think from the government perspective, we're looking at the notion of primary prevention, targeting the behavioural condition ones, and then providing the information regarding the risks involved in gambling, and providing the accurate statistic in terms of how many win and lose, and how many people are behind in a particular year. Giving more information in terms of the public education approach. And, the notion effectively is one of informing individuals of the risks and dangers involved in gambling. At the same time, we can't ignore the fact that gambling does provide some benefits and some excitement to a large percentage of the population as well, and hence people do keep coming back to gambling, enjoying it, and doing it within recreational limits. But effectively, the important element is to minimize harm as much as possible, and governments can do that through effectively education, through better regulatory approaches, and in terms of reducing the availability and accessibility of advertising and access to gambling forms. I think that's really quite important. But then on the other hand is to provide greater education about problem gambling within the mental health and addiction sphere. That's my 2 cents.
I agree with all of that. I think I might also sort of say, just, I mean, I come from, as a clinical psychologist who's done most of my career work in the area of addictions and mental health to a certain extent as well. You know, for me, I've really sort of come up with this idea of gambling disorder as being, in a lot of ways, oftentimes a response to other things that are going on, you know, a way of maladaptive way of coping with emotional problems, that sort of thing. But that's not always the case. You know, people who are more fit into more of the behaviorally conditioned gambling group don't necessarily have a lot of that. They're really sort of wrapped up in the contingencies. We had one paper that was actually, Leah and I were both on this paper. It's done by Jamie Lister, who's at Rutgers University. And it was interesting and unique in that he applied the pathways model to a group of individuals who were with opioid use disorder, who are receiving treatment in opioid use disorder treatment called mostly methadone, some Suboxone treatment. And for the most part, the analysis held up well with the pathways model. So applying it to an entirely different group of people with addictions, I thought was really quite interesting. And that made me think about, you know, transdiagnostic kind of elements. You know, can we apply something like the pathways model across people with other substance use problems? Can we apply it, for example, across the emerging, you know, people with emerging behavioral addictions like, you know, compulsive shopping or internet gaming disorder, compulsive sexual behavior or food addiction or other things? You know, I mean, is it possible that this could be a transdiagnostic model that could cross over other things? So.
It's really exciting to hear that sort of research is going on. And I've certainly been working with colleagues across different disciplines, for example, looking at economics, where they're using large data sets. And Luke, you're involved in some of this work as well. And Leah obviously is looking very closely at internet account-based gambling to see how we can look at behavior in isolation to look at risk levels and vulnerabilities. Do you think there's anything about the pathways model that could be picked up just by looking at behavior alone, or is it really more about the individual context that we need to understand?
I think it's the individual context that's really quite important. The behaviors at the point of presentation generally tend to be relatively similar, with substance abuse, depression, anxiety, family problems, etc. It's when you start to work backwards to look at the critical pathways that led to that you start to get a greater insights into how best to assist these particular people. In terms of the pathways model, how to apply it in other addictions, I think that there is good grounds in it, although I haven't actually applied it to other programs. But Rob Simpson years ago was indicating that the concept did match his experience with the alcohol addiction field as well, but it hasn't been taken up by the addiction fields to any great extent. And I suspect that's partly because of the silo effect of gambling and other addictions to some level. There's sort of challenges in terms of crossover, in terms of presenting at various conferences. The two aren't really mixed. And I think part of that comes from the early, some of that comes from the early history where gamblers didn't see themselves as alcohol or substance abusers, and substance abusers didn't like gamblers because it was a lifestyle issue. But then again, I'm talking through my head.
Well, and as we're drawing to a close, it's a nice segue to how I'd like to wrap up. And it's just been a pleasure to see all of you and to hear from you. It has been a while. International conferences are just starting up, but maybe this is a nice opportunity for each of us, or each of you rather, to reflect on the influence of the pathways model, but also the influence of the colleagues, the people on this call and the other people, the way that these sort of conceptual models allow collegial conversations and research across labs and research across boundaries and fields. This is one of these, like you say, this broader model that can influence so many people. Maybe you can just we'll close out by going around, everyone can share about how they have use these sorts of models and these kind of techniques and cross-disciplinary aspects to build their own research career, but also the labs and that idea of what Alex and Leah, you were talking about, these noodling. How can we do more of that, develop our own conceptual ideas through working and chatting with each other? Luke and Dave, do you want to start off?
Yeah, I can jump in there, Sally, and the special issue that we put together, well, as the guest editors for the journal, it was me and Dave and also Joel Billier, who couldn't join us today with the time difference, but a big thank you to Joel as well, who brought a lot of expertise with behavioral addictions outside of gambling, which we were keen to feature. And I kind of feel like the three of us were a little nervous in the early stages of the special issue, whether we'd get submissions. As we were saying earlier, it's the pathways model itself kind of demands quite large samples, and some parts of it, need the GPQ to get at. So we didn't quite know how it would go, but it got a really strong response right from the initial call. And over the time of the special issue, there were a few other, big papers published, like the kind of update paper that Leah was talking about earlier. So I get the impression there was quite a kind of sense of buzz in the end, and it all ended up being quite timely. So it was a real honor to be involved in that process.
Thanks for doing that, Luke, and leading that. And just to highlight the fact that I had nothing to do with it.
I'd echo what Luke is saying, but I think Luke is being a little bit humble, because Luke was the one who brought us all together to do this. And he really did lead this special issue. And Joel was wonderful to work with as well. And it was a great, I think, honor to work with these guys and really get a sense of where they're all coming from a collegial standpoint, especially because we did a lot of this during the pandemic when we weren't going to conferences and things. We were doing a lot of emailing. We did a couple of Zoom calls, that sort of thing. But for the most part, when you're involved in a project like this, and you get to work with like really smart people, from elsewhere, it's gratifying. And it came at a time where we weren't getting a lot of gratifying, other than daily grind Zoom calls all day long. Other than that, it was great to work with these guys.
I just want to, it was an honor for you to choose this as a topic. And I want to thank Sally and Kahlil for choosing it for a topic for this. It's very exciting. I think the next frontier with all of this from like our shop is to move into like transgenerational, look at the genetic components, the polygenic scores. I'm working with a geneticist. And I think one of the ways you do these collaborations is you meet people in totally different disciplines. You start talking about this and they say, oh, well, that maybe we could do this and get this DNA. And of course, then they lose me. It's like Charlie Brown's teacher. But at that point, you then can, put something together that's new and different. And that's what's really exciting about taking this forward.
I would just have a quick comment, and just to encourage researchers coming in the field to focus on sort of conceptual issues, not just specific research questions, but rather how everything integrates and is coordinated and synthesized, particularly from other fields as well. And despite the fact that it may not have an immediate impact, it may in fact emerge over a period of time.
Well, it's just been a wonderful conversation. I'm sure we probably could have filled up several more hours on this topic. So I appreciate everybody keeping their comments, right to that 60-minute window. We've done really well today. But let me thank each of you, Leah, Alex, Luke, and Dave. That was just a wonderful session. For anybody who wants more information about this model. Obviously, there's the original paper. There is the special issue, which has come out in International Gambling Studies, as well as the new updated paper in addiction as well. So please check all of that out. It's just a fantastic contribution to the field. So thank you all for your work today, as well as thank you for all of your work bringing that wonderful content to the field. It is incredibly valuable and something that I use and reference all the time in my own work. Next,
I'll be happy for young researchers to contact me if they want any comments as well. It's always good for young researchers to have contact with people in the field who've been there for too long.
That's fantastic to hear. So everybody, please spam Alex as much as you want. He has probably agreed to it. Next week, we have another session. And in that session, we have two speakers. One speaker, if you're not familiar with him personally, you may recall him from the season 1 of our seminar series, Spencer Murch, where he talked about immersion dissociation. The topic next week that we'll be talking about is behavioral markers, and joining him will be Tim Edson. Tim is at the Division on Addiction, and Spencer is at Concordia University. A very interesting talk. This kind of builds on some of the themes that we had talked about in the second season around machine learning. This is sort of the other half of the story about how do you build a risk detecting algorithm. One, you need to have that sort of technical model, and I think there is a lot more that we could dive into the series there. But next week, we're talking about behavioral markers and what can you actually see in the data that could give you an indication or something that you could feed into a machine learning model that might help you predict risk in a different way. One of the speakers, Tim Edson, is actually going to be talking about something that Luke talked on earlier today, which is early big wins. So if that is a topic that interests you, definitely tune in next week. But with that in mind, I will thank all the speakers today, as well as Sally and the Brain and Mind Center, along with Harrison Stein, who is our primary point person running the stream now. Thank you all, and we'll see you again next week.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
All right, and we're off.